Week 14 fantasy football sleepers. We're giving you players that you can stream this week in week 14, and we're going to give you plenty of players that you can stash for the fantasy football playoff run. This is a difficult week. Last week was a lot of fun. It was Thanksgiving week. You got football on Thursday. You had football on Black Friday. There were no players on buys. Ended up being some really, really high-scoring fantasy point totals last week. There were some games you'd see in some competitive leagues where it was like 170 something to 170 something. You love to see that. This is not that week. This is the week for you to get that win. This is the week for you to get through, make proper lineup decisions, and just get into it. And for a lot of you, this is a week where you're playing meaningful fantasy football. If you're still watching a video like this or listening to a podcast like this, then you are either in the fantasy football playoffs or you need that win this week to get into the fantasy football playoffs. And some of you might be competing for a bye week, which is just awesome. Nothing better than being able to chill out week 15 while everybody else is worried about it. But let's just get into it. This show is real sleepers. There's plenty of sleeper shows out there that will give you guys that are not sleepers at all, and they'll pass them off as sleepers, and that's fine. I saw a couple of people listing DeAndre Swift as a sleeper this week. I'm like, in what universe is this a sleeper? DeAndre Swift was highly drafted. DeAndre Swift has been in a lineup for most of the season. Being in a good matchup doesn't make you a sleeper. A sleeper is somebody that goes under the radar and oftentimes isn't even picked up on the waiver wire. That, to me, is the sleeper. And all the guys I'm going to talk to you about today are available to you in 70% of leagues or more. So some of you might call this deep sleepers, and I think that's a fair way of looking at it. But some of you play in deeper leagues, very competitive leagues. We're going to list plenty of players that might even be available for you on that secondary waiver wire run. Let's get after it right now. Let's first get out of the way the teams that are on bye weeks this week. Baltimore Ravens on a bye, Denver Broncos on a bye, Houston Texans on a bye, Indianapolis Colts on a bye week, the New England Patriots on a bye week, and the Washington Commanders. So you're really getting a lot of impact at the quarterback position. Lamar Jackson's out. Jaden Daniels is out. This is a week where the quarterback position is going to be impacted. There's also, obviously, every position is going to be impacted this week, but there's going to be quarterback streamers that some of you need to use. And let's go ahead and get after it. And again, we're talking about players that are available to you in 70% of leagues or more. So a couple guys I don't say on this list doesn't mean they're bad plays. It means that they're not available at that level. Let's talk about Will Levis. Will Levis is available to you in 81% of leagues. He's passed for 2 touchdowns in 3 out of his last 4 games. This week they play the Jacksonville Jaguars. And next week is the Cleveland Browns, which has turned into an absolute shootout team. Jameis Winston was a guy that we talked about a lot on this show for weeks and weeks and weeks. Now he's rostered in too many leagues to discuss, obviously passing for a ton of yards down there. But Levis is a player that has been playing a lot better. He missed time this season. Mason Rudolph started a couple games. And since Levis has come back, he's been playing a lot better. Now, there's some issues there. Levis takes a lot of sacks. Levis is capable of throwing a bad pick. But Levis is also capable of putting a big fantasy performance up this week against Jacksonville. And if he does very, very well, we can consider him next week against Cleveland. I like Will Levis as a streamer, and I'm using him in a big spot where I have a Lamar Jackson and Bo Nix team, and Levis is right in my lineup this week. Drake Maye, a player for you to stash. Maye is available to you in 86% of leagues. Last week, he had 59 rushing yards, and he finished quarterback 10 on the week. So Maye gave you a QB1 performance last week. It was one of his better fantasy performances overall on the season. And so he heads to the bye week with a lot of positive momentum fantasy-wise. We're going to keep an eye on Drake Maye. If you're able to stash a quarterback, he is the one. And then we've got to talk about Bryce Young. Bryce Young is a player that I think a lot of us are going to take L's on because I was ready to sort of bury Bryce Young last year. And then early this year when Andy Dalton took over, this was one where it's sort of like, hey, we told you so. Bryce Young was a bad pick, all this kind of stuff. But Bryce Young, I'm ready to take my L because Bryce Young looks like he's in the driver's seat to be the starting quarterback in Carolina next year in 2025. He's totally rejuvenated himself under Dave Canales, and Dave Canales is the quarterback whisperer. We should have seen this one coming a little bit more. I mean, I think that we were kind of hopeful for it, and then a little too judgmental on the poor play early. Ever since he's come back from being benched, Bryce Young has been the quarterback. The last 3 weeks stand out the most. Quarterback 17, quarterback 14, and that quarterback 14 performance was in that near win over the Kansas City Chiefs, where Young played very well. And then QB 8 this past week against Tampa, which was one of the better games of Bryce Young's entire career. He had 298 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. And there should have been a third touchdown, but Adam Thielen, they overturned that touchdown call late in the week. So they've got a difficult matchup against Philadelphia this week, but they play that Tampa Bay Buccaneers team again in week 17 and the Dallas Cowboys again in week 15. So Bryce Young, you can potentially stream him this week with tempered expectations in a difficult matchup against Philly, but this is also a player that I will stash for the fantasy football playoffs because of those 2 really strong matchups in week 15 and week 17. Dave Canales gets the most out of quarterbacks. We saw him do it with Geno. Geno Smith turned everything around in Seattle. We saw Baker Mayfield sort of have this career renaissance in Tampa Bay. He had Russell Wilson when Wilson had his best ever season as a pro when he was quarterbacks coach in Seattle. Wilson had his best ever fantasy season, I should say, under Canales. So Canales gets the most out of these quarterbacks. You're seeing it with Bryce Young. And then a deep sleeper, one especially for Superflex managers, Aiden O'Connell, AOC. AOC is available in 94% of leagues. Viable Superflex starter this week, and he's a DFS and streaming consideration dart throw if you're in desperate need. He had 340 passing yards and 2 touchdown passes in Vegas's loss to the Kansas City Chiefs. He's hyper-targeting Brock Bowers. He's targeting Jacoby Myers. So he's got good pass catchers, and in Bowers, he's got a great pass catcher. And that Kansas City game, the Raiders could have won that one. That was a 2-point loss. This week, he goes up against that same Tampa Bay defense that Bryce Young just shredded. So they're a bottom 3 pass defense in Tampa. We love targeting defenses like that. So I don't know your situation, but if you're in complete jam, I like Aiden O'Connell more than like Derek Carr to put it in that sort of low-level quarterback level. Aiden O'Connell played well last week, passed for a ton of yards and 2 touchdowns. We'll see if he can do it again. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back. We're going to talk about running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends to get you through the week that you can stream or you can stash for the fantasy football playoffs.
This episode is brought to you by Player Profiler, the Dynasty Deluxe package. The rankings are the best in the industry. It includes strategy mode where you can say, hey, change the rankings to be win now. Oh, change the rankings to be productive struggle. There's also a draft planner to help strategize where you should take players because the draft planner also includes ADP. There's a trade finder where we look up on My Fantasy League and we see trades that are done, including a particular player. Then there's a trade analyzer where you can plug in draft picks, players, and we assign a lifetime value to draft picks out 5 years. The best thing about our trade analyzer, it can't be gamed with volume. And there's mock draft data to see right now what's the market for player X versus player Y, including in the fall when very few mock drafts are happening. And our Dynasty guide, the Dynasty Dominator, would cost you $10 on Amazon, but you get it for free with Dynasty Deluxe, and you get our rookie guide for free, a $25 value. So you get all of that for $45. I mean, it's a great deal.
Welcome back. We're talking about fantasy football sleepers. We're talking about week 14, and we're also keeping an eye on the fantasy football playoffs coming right around the corner. 3-week sprint. Time to get that money. Time to get that championship. Let's talk about some running backs, though, this week. A lot of these players are going to be stashes for your bench. Tyler Allgeier, this is your handcuff running back to Bijan Robinson. Allgeier's available to you in 70% of leagues. If Bijan were to miss a week, Allgeier would be an instant top 15, top 18 running back. He would get the targets. He would get the carries. He might even see almost identical volume to Bijan. Bijan had the most touches he's ever had as a pro last week. Tyler Allgeier is capable of a 25-touch game if Bijan were to miss a game. So he's got a lot of value on your bench as a lottery ticket. Can't put him in the lineup anymore. They're using Bijan too much. So Allgeier is not at all a handcuff plus consideration, but he does have contingent upside if Bijan misses a week. Ray Davis, available to you in 78% of leagues, one of the best handcuffs in football. And now Ray Davis has enough juice to be used this week if you're in like bye week hell and I need a dart throw running back. I would rather use Ray Davis than some of these guys who maybe aren't talented, but you're kind of like guessing they would get some touches. With Ray Davis, he scored 4 touchdowns this season, and he has 3 double-digit scoring weeks over his last 6 games. If James Cook were to miss a game, we already have seen what Ray Davis is capable of doing. Ray Davis had 150 combined yards in the week that James Cook missed. So we've already seen him do it. So he's got contingent upside as a lottery ticket, and this week, because of all the teams on bye, he's got value to you in the flex if you're in a jam. Trey Benson, available to you in 79% of leagues. Same thing, valuable handcuff. If James Conner misses a game, wheels up for Benson. He's a stash. Blake Corum, available to you in 84% of leagues. Corum had 42 rushing yards last week, and at the half, it was like, okay, here we go. It's like some sort of a committee. All the fumbles for Kyren Williams have added up, all these narratives being kind of shaped. And then, of course, Kyren Williams dominates in the second half. But Corum did show you a little bit of juice as a runner, and this is a player that if Kyren Williams were to miss time, Corum would be a top 15 play. Cam Akers. Cam Akers is available to you in 84% of leagues. Only a handcuff to Aaron Jones. Does not have the sort of value that Ray Davis would have in a desperation mode, but he still has value as a lottery ticket if Jones misses a game. Now, here's a fun one. Sincere McCormick. So Sincere McCormick gets elevated off of the practice squad. Now they've signed him to the team. So we've seen this story before. Last year, Zamir White was not really out of nowhere like McCormick, but Zamir White was hardly used at all. Then Zamir White gets his opportunity, plays well, and then Antonio Pierce and the Raiders just ride him for like 4 or 5 games. And Zamir White gave you RB2 value for like 5 weeks. And then, of course, Zamir White this season enters the season as the starter and failed as a draft pick this year. But Zamir White last year was a super impactful waiver wire addition. We had him very highly ranked in my waiver wire show. I took some flack for that one last year. Some people were like, why aren't you ranking him and Abdullah? I'm like, no, Zamir White's going to be the dude. And Zamir White was. But the story here is we've seen Antonio Pierce give opportunity to the next man in and not make it into like a big committee and give that player volume. So Alexander Mattison is questionable. Zamir White is out. Amir Abdullah is still around. But I think there's a lot of value in adding Sincere McCormick. He's available in 90% of leagues. 64 rushing yards against Kansas City last week. Highly productive collegiate at UT San Antonio. And he had like 3,000 rushing yards in college. So this is a player that I think is a really good speculative add. Stash him. And if you're completely desperate this week, it's worth a dice roll if Alexander Mattison is out, that he just repeats it. But I think he's more of a, let's see if maybe his carries go up this week and he gets 15 carries. All of a sudden, we're talking about a guy we might be able to use in week 15. And then on the flip side, Amir Abdullah is still available to you in 84% of leagues. Did his damage last week on special teams. So if you're just looking through like the fantasy box scores, like production was down. But if you're in a league that has some sort of special team scoring, he balled. So Amir Abdullah, we've seen him have a 15-point week. I'm more on Sincere McCormick right now. We know what Abdullah is. And speaking of know what they are, Travis Homer has been a guy that hasn't done anything this year. Available in 97% of leagues for a reason. And who are the 3% of managers that were rostering Homer? I guess it's people reacting to the injury, but Homer now has an immediate opportunity. Homer's the kind of player where I record this on Saturday. If we get news on Saturday night, you could see Homer be a guy that's heavily picked up Sunday morning. So consider picking him up because Roschon Johnson was ruled out. And Roschon Johnson's had a pretty clear role over the last few weeks as like a goal line back. But now DeAndre Swift is questionable with a quad injury. So I think Swift is going to play. But if he, for whatever reason, has a setback Sunday morning, you could be talking about Travis Homer in an outsized role. And the one thing that Homer does, we talked about the 15-point week for Abdullah. Homer can catch the football. So like Homer has pass catching ability, and if he's in a near full-time role, he could have flex value this weekend, available to you in 97% of leagues. Kendre Miller, a player for you to stash, available in 96% of leagues. Darren Rizzi, the coach in New Orleans, has been like praising Miller. So Miller's coming off the IR. Miller might be a guy where the Saints are just like, whatever, we're using him. We're going to give him the ball. So he's worth a stash for me. They need bodies. Taysom Hill injured, all these wide receiver injuries. This is a team in need of skill position players who can handle touches. We know Alvin Kamara is going to produce, but there's no reason that Kendre Miller couldn't take on a 10 touches a game role. And if Kamara were to go down, Miller would be the guy, I think, in the next few weeks. Kimani Vidal, available to you in 87% of leagues. The backup behind Gus Edwards. Edwards has been uninspiring. Let's talk about the wide receiver position. Oh, and before we go, like away from running backs, Braelon Allen, we've been telling you to stash him all season long. We've had him on the waiver wire all season long. And this is a player that now looks like he's going to be the next man in, with Breece Hall set to miss this week. So some of you watch this and you're like, why are you saying all these handcuff running backs? Because these are the sort of players that immediately would step in and be high volume, high touch players if the starter ahead of them went down. And now we're in a weekly game. We're not a seasonal game anymore. This is a 4-week sprint to get the money, get the trophy. So if you had a 1 week out of a Blake Corum, you're going to understand like why we're stashing these kind of guys. And any Braelon Allen manager out there, you're feeling pretty good about everything. If you're rostering Zach Charbonnet in a more shallow format, same thing. Charbonnet is going to go in if Ken Walker misses. We've already seen him thrive. So these backup running backs, even if it's 1 week, gets you through a playoff matchup potentially. Talking about the wide receiver spot, a few weeks ago, we've had Adam Thielen. We kept talking about Adam Thielen. We had him ranked highly in the waiver wire show. We had him discussed heavily on this show, and it sort of is happening. Thielen played great last week. Thielen looks like the number one target in Carolina for the rest of the way. If you picked him up, great job. He's obviously too rostered to discuss here. But let's talk about Xavier Legette. Xavier Legette is available to you in 73% of leagues. He had 8 targets last week, caught 4 passes for 53 yards. So Legette's getting like targeted. He's on the field the whole time. Jalen Coker is still injured, but Xavier Legette is one to consider. And Carolina gets that week 17 matchup against Tampa Bay. I would say Legette is still a player that Carolina wants to get the ball to and keep building upon to build momentum heading into 2025, their first round pick. So Legette, interesting player to add. Elijah Moore, a lot of disrespect on the wire this week for Moore. It's obviously the Jerry Jeudy show. Cedric Tillman could be back. And then we're talking about David Njoku. So the Browns wide receiver room has a lot of bodies and a lot of guys who are producing and a lot of competition for targets. But at the end of the day, it's a high volume passing game. Jameis is playing at a high level for fantasy, and Elijah Moore is available to you in 80% of leagues. Played terrific on Monday against Denver. Finished with 8 catches for 111 yards on 14 targets. Moore's been targeted 8 times or more in 4 out of his last 5 games played. He can be used in the flex this week, even in a tough matchup against Pittsburgh. Demarcus Robinson, available in 81% of leagues. He's had a touchdown. Now, he's had 6 touchdowns in 6 games played. So touchdown or bust player, really not a recommended start at all. But if you are in a complete jam, this is a game that could pop over. The Rams and the Bills could go at it. This could be a high-scoring game in LA. Rams really need to get a win against Buffalo this week. And Demarcus Robinson is towards the league lead in end zone targets. He's top 10 overall in end zone targets this year. Ray McCloud. Ray McCloud is available to you in 84% of leagues. We saw him finish with 95 receiving yards last week, which was obviously a season high for him. Most of his yardage came on a 60-yard catch and run. So some people will say, wasn't a real 95 because he had the big 60-yard. Forget that stuff. He had a 60-yard catch and run. That sort of demands more opportunities. Ray McCloud against Minnesota. Atlanta's going to have to pass the football. And Kirk Cousins is struggling, but Atlanta's still going to have to pass the football. Ray McCloud, if you're in a super deep format, is viable as like a dart throw flex this week. Trey Tucker, available to you in 93% of leagues. He had 7 catches for 82 yards in week 12, and then he scored a 58-yard touchdown in week 13. He's a desperation flex option with 6 teams on a bye. Parker Washington. Parker Washington, available in 96% of leagues, targeted 12 times last week. He had 6 catches for 103 yards and a touchdown. Now, we can't count on double-digit targets from Parker Washington. Don't get me wrong here, but I do think he's done enough that he is going to be deserving of targets week in, week out. So maybe we can count on him for another 6 to 8 targets this week. He's obviously has advantageous matchups in the slot. We'll see what Mac Jones can do. Tough to use Parker Washington, but it's difficult to find targets on the wire right now. Darius Slayton. Malik Neighbors is headed to get an MRI. We don't know the results of that, but Malik Neighbors, there's a non-0% chance that he's not playing this week, and he might not play the rest of the season, depending on what's going on with his hip. Darius Slayton, available in 93% of leagues. We saw what Slayton was able to do earlier in the year in weeks 5 and 6. He had 1 monster game and 1 usable week and we had him on this show. Malik Neighbors was out, and he gave you a wide receiver 1 performance. So Slayton is a player that New York is desperate for skill position players to come and absorb targets. If Neighbors is out, Slayton was as close to the Neighbors role as anybody else in this offense earlier in the year. He had a very high target share, a very high air yard share when Neighbors was out. So I might pick up Darius Slayton a few places. And I think if Neighbors is out for the rest of the year, Slayton's like a wide receiver 3 and one who could actually absorb a number of targets because of how bad the quality of the offense is and really the lack of pass catching weapons in New York. Theo Johnson is also out last week. So Theo Johnson, tight end, but he was getting 6 targets a game over the last few weeks. A lot of problems in New York. That team is bad, and they're going to be in a lot of situations where they're trailing a lot as well. So the game flow could actually help Slayton and some of the other players. Even though they're ugly starts and ugly potential dart throws, there might be some value there in chasing the targets. Now, tight end, there's some fun options. Noah Gray, available to you in 80% of leagues. Gray scored 2 touchdowns in back-to-back games in weeks 11 and 12. And then he added another 4 catches for 58 yards in week 13. And he had a season-high 6 targets. Gray is becoming like a weekly threat in the Kansas City offense. And you could say it's because of a lack of wide receivers, or it could just be Gray has taken a step forward in his game, and they're like, we need to use him, and more of these 2 tight end sets are difficult to defend. So if you're in bad shape at tight end, consider Gray. He's got a great matchup in week 15 against Cleveland. Cleveland's been very generous to opposing tight ends this season, and Gray has some juice. 3 straight weeks where he's been solid for fantasy. And 2 of those weeks was obviously very good, but last week was almost more reassuring because it wasn't just touchdowns, and he was still able to earn targets. Mike Gesicki. Gesicki's available to you in 85% of leagues. He's a player that we were high on when T. Higgins was out. Gesicki played great fantasy-wise when T. Higgins was out. He gave you big-time performances, and then Higgins returned, and Gesicki just disappeared. But last week, Gesicki had 5 catches for 53 yards. This was his best performance without Higgins all year, so this is something that they can build on. Juwan Johnson, available to you in 92% of leagues. I had Juwan Johnson as a top 10 overall in my waiver wire rankings this week. I still think he's a very good value right now. Taysom Hill was a huge part of the offense, not just with the run attempts, but also with the targets that Hill's been receiving. Those should all go to Johnson. Then you combine that with Johnson's ability to sort of play the slot and be like a big tight end in the slot. Then you put it together with the lack of wide receiver talent on New Orleans, and Johnson has a chance to be a low-end tight end 1 this week, at least a high-end tight end 2, and he's widely available. If you lost Dallas Goedert, then consider a Juwan Johnson. Dawson Knox. This is only if Kincaid misses another game, but if Dalton Kincaid misses another game, then Knox becomes another streaming option. The Rams have been very generous to opposing tight ends this season. And then the final tight end to discuss, Grant Calcaterra. Grant Calcaterra is going to be on the field a ton. He's going to run a ton of routes. I don't know how much fantasy production he's going to have. His best game this season was like a 5-catch game. But again, Dallas Goedert on the IR. Calcaterra will be on the field a ton. One wide receiver I forgot to mention, David Moore. Jalen Coker's out again. So if you're in like NFFC, FFWC, like a wide receiver heavy, deep format, David Moore should be rostered. He's been targeted 19 times over the last 2 games played. I'm Theo Gremminger. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe to the video if you're watching on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed on the channel. Really appreciate all the support all year with this show. We'll come back. We'll do some fantasy football sleepers. But this is the time. Go get that extra time looking through your rosters. Make sure you're not carrying any dead weight into the fantasy football playoffs. And let's go get that win this week. And let's get 3 more wins. Let's get some championships this season. Let's get it.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.